Welcome to this week's episode of Two Angry Men, where Harvey and Mark discuss LA riots or LA protests and Donald Trump's response. Enjoy.
Have you ever heard of a president threatening a governor, like Governor Newsom, with arrest, and Karen Bass with arrest? I mean, look at what is in front of you right now. Welcome to the Two Angry Men podcast. Mark, LA is on the verge of a riot, and I think it's exactly what Donald Trump wants.
I don't disagree with you because clearly not enough people are sitting in the prison cell where you are right now. But apparently,
yes, I am not in detention,
Okay.
but there are a lot of people who are in detention, and I have to tell you something. I mean, you and I go way, way back. I covered the LA riots, and there is a dynamic when something starts as a protest and then turns into a riot. And the dynamic is this. There are people who have a cause initially, and they come out for that cause. But as soon as there is confrontation with law enforcement and things get out of hand in any way, there are opportunists who come along. And there are opportunists who want to turn it into supermarket sweep, and they start looting. And that's exactly what happened with the LA riots. That, remember, it was on the heels of the Rodney King verdict. Reginald Denny was the flashpoint. And within a couple of hours, I remember being down there, just seeing people pulling TVs and whatnot out of stores. And it just became an opportunity. And then all of a sudden, you know, the public looks at it and they're confused because they just think it's a protest. So they think everybody who's doing this is part of that protest. So, it feels like this is right out of Donald Trump and Stephen Miller's playbook. Trump talked about this during the election. He talked about calling in the National Guard and specifically talked about Los Angeles and even talking about bypassing the governor, which he did. So this feels pre-planned.
Well, LA does, you talk Rodney King. I'm old enough, as are you, to remember when my dad was a DA in the 60s, the riots that happened back then as well. LA has a rich history of this where it happens kind of almost every generation. And you are right that there is a very fine line. And once it gets crossed, then people expect and want that there's some kind of law and order. And there's always that kind of pendulum swing that happens. When they didn't quite want that during what was happening during COVID, but they did want it back during Rodney King. They did want it during the Watts riots, and you're already seeing calls for it now. I was perplexed a little bit, I will tell you, that there hasn't, during the fires, there was looting, and there was not as big a show of force then, and there has not been as big a show of force until it appears that the Waymo cars were lit on fire. I don't know why that was.
But it wasn't just the way. It wasn't just the Waymo cars, and the fires were different because there was no protest there. There was evacuation, and there was upset. This is a specific cause. To me, it is like that Rodney King verdict. But the interesting overlay for me is Gavin Newsom and Donald Trump. They hate each other. I can tell you, I know this for a fact, and I know it for a fact, that Gavin Newsom cannot use the word Trump privately without the word fucking preceding it. Fucking Trump, fucking Trump.
Well, Trump does call him, you saw in his last tweet, he calls him new scum.
Yeah.
And they do have, there's a familial connection as well. Or there was.
Well, there was.
Yes, there was.
We're getting far astray with getting into.
Well, but I think there is a certain amount of theatrics here on both sides. I agree with you that the protest gets hijacked. LA is a sprawling place, and these protests are centralized to some degree. Downtown is kind of a flashpoint right now. Paramount before that was a flashpoint, which is kind of off the beaten path for a lot of people. And what you're seeing, I think, is something that was predicted. I was just talking to somebody this morning about it. The one thing that with Donald Trump is what you either voted or didn't vote for is what you're going to get. And the Stephen Miller, who famously grew up on the west side of LA, knew exactly what he was doing. Trump knows, I think, exactly what he's doing. He's provoking Newsom by calling him news scum.
Well, he threatened to arrest him.
Yeah.
Threatened to arrest him.
Well, you saw the Maxine Waters. I'm shocked that they didn't arrest Maxine Waters yesterday, because that would have fit right into the playbook.
Right. But look, here is the danger, I think, that when during the Civil War in the 1800s, it was a very defined thing. You had the North versus the South, and they were all kind of defined separate areas. When you talk about immigration, and especially in Los Angeles, it's all interlaced, that 40% of the population is Latino, and then trying to distinguish between documented and undocumented, and the fact that there are Latinos, they don't live in one pocket. They live everywhere. And they may work in certain places and live in certain places. But if you think about the possibility of an uprising on either side, and I'm not saying it's just going to be on the side of immigrants, it could be on the other side, because I remember, I can tell you that during George Floyd, there were just a slew of people in Beverly Hills and West LA who went out and bought guns, and people, they're not used to this. And when they see something that scares them, they could overreact. And all it takes is one flashpoint for this to happen. Reginald Denny was one flashpoint, and the entire city erupted.
Reginald Denny. Do you remember who represented Reginald Denny? Here's another fun fact. It was Johnny Cochran.
It was Johnny.
Yeah, it was Johnny Cochran who represented Reginald Denny, who famously, for those, and maybe somebody will cut in, it was an awful video, but of him getting beaten in the intersection. That caused subsequent prosecutions and things of that nature. But remember, we also in California have a rich history of periodically demonizing immigrants. I mean, the ex-governor, Pete Wilson, did it to great effect. What was it, Prop 187, which I used to always get a kick out of with the numerical reference. And there's always, for some reason, the immigrants in California, and by the way, one of the things that you will see happening when they started arresting hotel workers up in Pasadena the other day, I said, well, you're going to start to get some pushback here. It kind of reminds me of tariffs when you start hitting on other people. When you start crippling the businesses by taking away their source of labor, there isn't a ready supply that is coming in to replace that labor pool.
I just disagree with you. I mean, there were polls taken in the last month that show the majority, there are different polls showing different things, but there are several polls showing the majority of people don't just want criminal illegal aliens deported, they want every illegal alien deported. And, that's kind of been an underpinning. Donald Trump talks about criminals, but then he just, there's a quota now in the White House where Stephen Miller is saying you got to get rid of at least 3,000 a day. And so this is not as surgical as you think. And the fact is that depending on the poll you look at, up to 56% of the people just want a wholesale removal of illegal aliens. And by the way, you may be right that eventually they're going to start feeling it, but the eventually is going to come after what could be a civil war. And I mean, I don't want to sound hyperbolic here, but again, I have seen it. I saw it in '92 in LA, where one flashpoint, Reginald Denny, just ignited the whole city. And then when it ignited the city, the opportunists came in, and then everybody confused the people who were upset about the verdict with the opportunists, saying, look what they did. And it caused some huge racial strife. But if that happens here, and people can't distinguish between looters and people who are legitimately upset about, being yanked out of Home Depot, there's going to be this anti-immigrant movement that's going to make what's going on now look like a little ripple.
This is where I disagree. If there is some kind of a Reginald Denny, George Floyd kind of flashpoint, I call it in the economics they call it a black swan event of some kind. But in this case, I think what will happen first is more the playbook with tariffs. I think what will happen first is as soon as people realize hotels, restaurants, agriculture, all the things that California relies on enormously for immigrants to supply a seasonal and not so seasonal employment, you're going to find pretty soon people are going to say, wait a second here, this isn't what I signed up for. It was the same thing with the tariffs, and the tariffs have been, to some degree, rolled back or softened as soon as there was an impact on people's 401k. Then people, once it hits the pocketbook, you can't maintain this kind of thing.
Does it strike you as more than coincidental that days after Trump activates the National Guard and bypassing the governor, that tanks are rolling out in Washington, D.C. to, whether he acknowledges it or not, to celebrate his birthday, that we are right on the precipice of a dictatorship, of an authoritarian rule. I mean, on the East Coast, we're seeing tanks. On the West Coast, we're seeing, armed military. He's talked about now activating Marines. I mean, are you not feeling this?
No, I'm not there yet.
Mark.
I don't want to get hyperbolic. I don't want to go.
I don't think it is. I don't think it's hyperbolic.
I don't think we're there yet. I don't know that we'll ever get there. I have great confidence in the American public to say time out. I mean, there's always the pendulum swing. There's always going to be the pushback, especially when it hits and people say, no, I didn't sign up for this. I think that there is the California to some degree plays into this. And they play into this just by virtue of, I'll give you an example. I saw yesterday my good friend and sometime nemesis, Nathan Hochman, posting on Instagram yesterday.
He's your good friend now.
Yeah, well, I may say that with a twinkle in my eye. Think of this thought experiment. Can you imagine what would be happening if George Gascon was still the DA in LA?
Let's not go down that rabbit hole.
Well, because this is what I'm going to say. So Hochman is posting on Instagram. Maybe you can pull it up.
The DA for people who don't know.
The DA, fiercely protective of First Amendment rights. Well, I will tell you that plays right into this kind of narrative that is being created and makes us look idiotic, frankly, and has a unintended consequence of firing up and increasing the caricature that is Los Angeles and writ large California. And Newsom, if he, what do you want to call that? The white hot burning rage that he has there, which they would call the Trump derangement syndrome. I think he could take a step back and try to recalibrate a little bit his response here. I think there is an appropriate.
And what, Donald Trump's going to become reasonable?
No, not at all. But you don't feed into, the bad pun intended. You don't throw more gasoline on the fire of making yourself look even more like a caricature than you already are. Just deal with it. Go in there and say, we do not need the National Guard, or define who the National Guard is so people understand that the National Guard is, they've got an armory sitting over there in Culver City and the west side of LA.
Mark, Okay, first of all, he said we don't need the National Guard, and Trump's saying, fuck you. Secondly, what you said at the beginning, which is the American people wouldn't tolerate a dictatorship. I will refer you to 9 huge law firms that folded like cheap suits when Donald Trump said, you're either going to do this pro bono work or I'm going to lock you out of federal practice. And they didn't put up a fight. You've got news organizations paying Donald Trump millions of dollars. Over the weekend, ABC suspended Terry Moran for daring to take a stand on Stephen Miller. So you're saying that the American backbone is strong? The American backbone is non-existent right now. Everybody is afraid of him and they are cowering to him. And again, you may like some of his policies. There are some policies I like of Donald Trump's, but in terms of authoritarianism, you can't deny what we're seeing, and there is no backbone. It's the exact opposite that's going on.
Let me just kind of dissect a little bit. First, let's start with big law. Big law has always been about one thing. It's how do you maximize profits on the backs of associates by billing large corporations and large corporate interests. The only way that you get up to these multi-million-dollar, in some cases over $10 million profits per partner, are by your billing corporate America and it's a symbiotic relationship. So is it surprising to me that big law backs down because corporate America is telling them, hey, you know, we don't want to have you getting in the way of what's happening. And then when you're talking about legacy media, and I saw the ABC thing, and what it led me to believe is that you actually, it actually supports kind of the prediction that's been made on the right, is that legacy media really is hiding behind this faux objectivity, that they're not really objective, that they have an agenda, and they might as well call it out and be upfront about it, which is kind of the Fox News playbook, which is in prime time, we have an opinion. Well, guess what? ABC in prime time has an opinion, whether they want to admit it or not. Now, you're right that there is some degree of kowtowing, but I think that's economic interest for the same reason, and I think it supports my argument, for the same reason that I don't think we're going to get to a point where there's a dictatorship, because at a certain point, when you pull the rug out from restaurants, from hotels, from car washes, from every other place, agriculture, you're going to see people push back immediately, just like they did with the tariffs.
Yeah. So what you're saying is that if you can't get your car washed, you're suddenly you're gonna find courage. I mean,
I'm going to tell you, I hate to be so transactional about it, but you know, there was many years ago, there was a term invented in Southern California, which was NIMBY. We're the original of not my backyard. And everything is great for thee, but not for me. And so when that comes about, then once it hits my pocketbook, once it hits your pocketbook, people have a different calculation. And the pocketbook, whether it's writ large for big law firms or whether it's writ large for large corporations, they tend to follow the money. I mean, that's unfortunately or fortunately.
Look, you may be right, but we're not going to have enough time to calibrate all that. Because if look, Mark, tanks on the East Coast, tanks on the West Coast, and talking about activating the Marines and talking about constantly calling out the National Guard when there are disturbances, now calling the protesters insurrectionists, which then opens up the door to really allowing a military presence. By the time the price of tomatoes goes up, he's going to have this country locked. And I mean, if you're ignoring that, and you know who's going to fight?
I wouldn't say that I'm ignoring it.
The law firms that folded are going to end up writing briefs supporting what Donald Trump is doing to the Supreme Court, and I don't even know that he's going to listen to the Supreme Court.
Well, look, the I know that is I used to have a law professor who used to call that the parade of horribles argument, that if we don't do this, then this is going to come and this is going to come. The fact is that even though a number of the law firms folded immediately, what has happened to those very law firms? Some of their biggest rate-making partners immediately left and started boutique firms. Some of the firms behind them said, we're going to stand up. In fact, I saw where the named partner at Sussman Godfrey, Sussman Godfrey was one of them. They won a injunction.
Well, but then your point is wrong, because you said 5 minutes ago that it was in the economic interest of these firms to do it, and that's why they did it. The fact is, it's terrible for the firms, but they just reflexively acted and crumbled, even though it's bad for business. I mean, it's not good for business. It's bad for their business.
Short-term, there's always a short-term economic calculus or knee-jerk reaction. What happened is that there were ones who saw, hey, this is a business opportunity. What happened? The first 9 or 8 out the door in the large law firms said, we're going to succumb. We can't survive this. Then then there was a reflection, a pendulum swing. And what happened? The second tier came in and said, hey, this is a great business opportunity. We're going to raid all of their rate makers. We're going to stand up to them because, by the way, we know we can win if we actually go to court, which they did. And they ended up raiding the firms that kind of rolled over. There is what was the dialectical, a thesis, an antithesis, and a synthesis. And that seems to explain 80% of the data in life, at least from my standpoint.
So let me attack this from a different angle.
Please.
Have you ever in your life heard a president? Well, actually,
I was going to say,
I can't think of one.
If you're going there, I think I know where you're going. 1968?
No, I'm actually thinking of, George Wallace, I'm thinking of. But aside from George Wallace, and that was a whole other thing, and they didn't even threaten to arrest George Wallace. They just called in the National Guard to allow students to go to the university. But have you ever heard of a president threatening a governor, like Governor Newsom, with arrest, and Karen Bass with arrest? I mean, look at what is in front of you right now. That he is threatening governors with arrest. He is calling out the military. He is defying the law, which says that the president is supposed to consult with the governor before activating the National Guard.
By the way,
look at what's in front of you.
We've already seen part of this, whether just because it's now we're talking about the legislative branch. Remember, they've already done a full broadside on the judicial branch. We have had judges who have been arrested famously, both Massachusetts and Wisconsin, for impeding immigration efforts. And they have done what I would have expected them to do, specifically in Wisconsin. They have written briefs on judicial immunity, and that'll be litigated through the courts. I just don't think
the courts that Donald Trump is going to ignore. I mean, he has made this.
I think that the courts are the bulwark. The courts are the safety net. The courts look, and I will readily say that I view courts with great reverence. I view the judiciary and what happens in courts with great reference. I've spent my entire adult life and part of my early adolescence in the courts and around the courts. I do not think that that is going to happen. I just do not see it happening.
Well, on the other side, as far as I'm concerned, the people who opened the door for Trump to defy courts, it's the left. It's when the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade. There were people, and I saw them on television. There were people with credentials saying, "Not my Supreme Court. I don't respect the Supreme Court. These justices are corrupt." When you start delegitimizing an institution like that, it's then Donald Trump comes in and just blows open the door. And that's just what happened. And he's done that. And I think he's made it really clear. He's already said, I'm not going to listen to federal district judges, and I don't think he's going to listen to courts of appeal. And I think then the only issue is if he feels like the 3 justices he appointed betray him, he's going to do the same thing with the Supreme Court and say, declare martial law and say, for the good of the country, I'm in control. I'm declaring martial law. I'm not going to listen to the Supreme Court. We're at a time of war. And I mean, I can't believe you're not seeing that. And Stephen Miller is just pulling all the levers.
Look, Stephen Miller has waited a long time for this, and he's got an agenda. And by the way, he and Trump. And you're talking to a lifelong Democrat, by the way. So it's not like
too. I am.
Right? It's a lifelong
people don't
Democrat.
believe it, but I am.
Right?
It's just the party. I feel like the party got in a party bus, and left me a little bit behind.
By the way,
I used to be on that bus.
You know who you famously, our subject of last Friday's pod or Saturday's pod was Elon Musk, who did that little stick drawing of where the party went.
He's not wrong.
By the way, Bill, another
wrong.
guy we've had on here, Bill Barr, has argued eloquently about this position. The problem is you got what was voted for. You accept the election, and guess what? There is a course correction. It's called 2026, and it's the House. And if the House goes back to the Democrats, that's how you course correct. I just think that's the beauty of this system.
It's really a great theory. Here's my feeling. I don't think we're going to get to 2026. That you're right, that the Republicans may lose one branch, but Donald Trump is acting at such an accelerated pace right now. Again, I'm sorry for repeating it. Tanks on the East Coast, tanks on the West Coast, activating the military. I mean, at a point this year, it feels like this is going to happen. And
let me tell you,
I'm sounding an alarm, man. I'm Paul revering it.
Okay. Well, and by the way, I mean, you could be right. Then I'll sit here and I'll give you whatever. I will just tell you that maybe 2 years ago, the left was saying things like, we've indicted him in Florida, we've indicted him in D.C., we've indicted him in Manhattan, and we've indicted him in Georgia. He's done. And that was where we were headed. He was never going to make a comeback, and blah, blah, blah. I mean, I've heard that before, and I just don't think that the system is going to break. I think that our constitutional system is brilliant, and I don't often think that it gets enough credit for just how brilliant it is. That you've got, I mean, think about it for a second. You've got a presidential election, but the founders understood that, by the way, you need a course correction, or you need an attaboy less than a year later to start campaigning for the following. And then you've got kind of the adults at the table, which is the Senate, which is every 6 years. It's an inherent beauty to the system and you've got the judges for life. I just think we can clearly pressure test this, but we're not going to have the crisis.
Okay. I want to get super cynical here, because I don't believe the majority of Americans really believe in democracy. I think they're for free speech as long as the speech is speech they agree with. And when it's speech they disagree with, all of a sudden they're okay with it being banned and books being banned and on and on and on. So I'm not a real believer that there is this shining light of democracy that everybody looks up to, unfortunately.
Well, I want
to ask you a question, and I want you to think about this and be really honest about it. Do you think if Donald Trump becomes a dictator, becomes an authoritarian ruler, do you think close to the majority of people in this country might actually like it?
No, I don't. I think it's overblown, number one. I will tell you, I don't disagree with you on your analysis of free speech. I will also tell you that that's the First Amendment, that it goes for the Sixth as well. I can't tell you the number of clients that I personally have represented And I think back 20 some odd years ago, where one of my clients was notorious and people prayed, and crashed my website that I would get cancer. Another client that I had was just celebrated around the world and people were cheering me on. There is a certain kind of affinity for what you believe in and a certain kind of deprecating of those you don't. So I get that. But I think at the end of the day, the American public is smart enough, and this system is constructed so magnificently that it's always going to bounce back. I don't think it can be broken by a Stephen Miller or anybody else. I think it's part of the beauty of the system that you just push but don't break.
You lived through Watergate. I'm surprised you're saying this because honestly, if it weren't for the tapes that surfaced, Nixon never would have resigned.
I agree. But by the way,
so you say the system is so solid. No, it's not. The system's not solid right now. It's not. And the system is crumbling. And what people are looking at is that they happen to believe in a point of view, and it doesn't matter how you achieve the goal. Just do it. And I don't think people necessarily respect the system of democracy. I don't think it matters to them as much as achieving their goal. And I know that's really pessimistic. Maybe I am just an old, angry man. But
I was just going to say today, you're making me not.
I know you sound like you're in a Broadway musical.
I was going to say I sound like the kid, the childlike naivete, because that's what it is. I do have a certain amount. I've watched it. And by the way, Watergate, you can make a compelling argument that the system did work and that it was because there was a forced bipartisanship at a certain point when it was a bridge too far. So that's kind of what gives me hope. And I guess it lets me kind of have the leap of faith.
Okay, I'll end it with this. This is really sad, but one of my favorite books in college was The Education of Henry Adams. He was the son and grandson of the two presidents. He was successful in his own right. He was, I believe, a Secretary of State. He was an ambassador. Right. And the book kind of like chronicled his life as a young boy. And he was so optimistic and really believed in the goodness of people and the institutions of democracy. And then you read his life. And as he gets older and older, all of that optimism starts to fade. And by the time he becomes an older man, he starts comparing people to something called, I remember this, a pteraspis, which is a shark that is an eating machine. It's was the most dangerous creature on earth. It doesn't kill to eat, it kills to kill. It just does. And by the end of the book, I mean, it's really sad. It's not a happy ending, that he has just a terrible view of humanity. And I'm not saying I'm there, but I'm on the trail. And I hate to say it.
When speaking of college, when I was there used to be an expression: if you're 20 and you're not a socialist, you don't have a heart. And if you're 40 and you're not a capitalist, you don't have a brain. So there are various adages that work. And speaking of college, I had a professor, Wyatt McGaffey, who I adored, was kind of a mentor and a curmudgeonly guy. And he used to postulate, and I found it's pretty true in life, that any theory, the best theory you could ever get, only accounts for 80% of the data. There's always that 10% on either side outliers that you just can't account for. So I'm going to go with the theory that the brilliance of the founders is in the resiliency of the system.
You just reminded me of
you
something.
Can be this. Yeah. What do you
there was a guy that I went to college with who was leading the Vietnam protests, and especially when the military was dropping napalm on North Vietnam, napalm made by Dow Chemical, and he was leading that charge. Guess where he ended up working?
Oh, well, they say we can do a whole episode on that.
Okay, we will continue this. There's something I think really important that we might want to jump on in the next day or two.
When do you get parole?
I'm not sure if I get time for good good behavior yet. I'll find
Okay,
out.
well,
tonight.
I'll agitate for good time, work time for you, Harvey. Have fun.
Okay, I'll see you.